o'clock, so we could start. Welcome everybody to this special session of the Heidegger and Classical Thought reading group. We're delighted to have Professor Julia Ireland and Professor William McNeill here today with us to share their experiences of translating our current text, which we've been reading since October. GA 39, Heidegger's first set of lectures on Hölderlin from 1934-35. I have a couple of questions prepared to get the discussion underway today, and then I'll open it up to the floor. The Q&A part of the session will last roughly, as I mentioned yesterday in the email, 45 minutes, and then Julie has very kindly offered to share her experiences of spending time with the GA39 manuscripts in Marbach, which will take up the last 15 minutes or so. And so the first question I'd like to pose is the question of translation itself, which is to ask, how did you both approach the task of translating Heidegger? How and for what reason did the idea of translating this particular text emerge for you both? And did you have conversations about how you might undertake this translation? You may well, of course, not remember such discussions clearly, so I could broaden the question out to encompass what I suppose you could call the ground of translation itself. What and who is a translation for? Who do you have in mind when you're translating? A general reader, a reader with a history in philosophy, a Heideggerian reader, someone else, or some mix of the three? Heidegger's German is notoriously difficult, perhaps nowhere more so than here. And every week we remark several times on how difficult it must have been to translate a particular sentence, word, or even an entire paragraph. Of course, when we read the German, we have the parallel text, the English and the German side by side. We're invited into the immediacy of the word itself in German. But in a translation, some of the heavy lifting is already an interpretation that's done for the reader. So I suppose my question is, how does an anticipation of your audience, your reader, influence the way in which you translate the text? If the text is particularly difficult, as this one no doubt is, how much of that difficulty should be passed on to the reader, and how much is subsidized, so to speak, by the translator? And so then to bring it back to how I commenced the question, how much did these potential issues of translation factor into your conversations before you started undertaking the translation of GA39? Julia and Will.
Well, I don't remember offhand just how much we discussed this particular issue, but I think we were pretty much on the same page to begin with, in that our audience, our anticipated audience and readership would really be a scholarly one, so an audience that's somewhat acquainted perhaps with Heidegger already or with Hölderlin, may or may not be, but coming from philosophy or comparative literature, European thought. Generally. So I think that was our anticipated audience. Julia, do you want to add something?
Yeah, Will and I had translated the ISTER course when I was in graduate school. And so we had that kind of collaborative conversation already. And I feel that I was very much apprenticing with Will, who is just an amazing translator. But I think that one of the things that we were sensitive to, probably more so with the Germanien and der Rhein course, in addition to the scholarly audience, is really trying to, there's so much more poetry that was translated, and trying to figure out how do we retranslate the poetry, and then also integrate the poetry, those translations, into how Heidegger's interpreting the poetry. And so I remember some pretty specific conversations about how we handle the poetry and the dialogue with the poetry, and trying to decide on terms that we translated, and then terms that may have been already in circulation from the ISTER course that we had translated, but we hadn't had that level of a conversation, and then also GA4. And so we wanted to try and be true to what was already out there. But I just remember feeling like the task of translating this volume was much greater and much more fraught because of the amount of different poems that were in it. Do you remember that conversation, Will, or like circling around that, like what you do with the poetry?
Very vaguely, to be honest. Yeah, but you're right. Yeah, there's a lot more poetry in it, and that was especially challenging. And of course, we discovered that we had to really we couldn't just adopt an existing translation of Hölderlin's poetry, and we had to tailor the translation of Hölderlin's hymns to Heidegger's interpretation as well. Yeah, so that meant reinterpreting and retranslating all of the Hölderlin stuff itself. So that was another aspect of the difficulty of it. I mean, with regard to the question of how much of the difficulty of the original should be passed on to the reader of the translation, I think this is an especially important question, and I think we were on the same page as this. In this regard. I mean, in my view, a translation of a text such as this should never be about reducing the intricacies of Heidegger's thought to some kind of lowest common denominator, as it were, in the sense of making it accessible to everyone at a glance. We want rather to convey much of the difficulty and the challenging character of the original in and through our translation. And I mean, to be a little perverse, I would even say we wouldn't be opposed to increasing the difficulty somewhat. So a translation of a serious text such as this, in which so much is at stake, should really be an invitation to the reader to appreciate the difficulties of the text and to experience, even to learn German, perhaps, to experience the need to consult the text in its original language. But it's also an opportunity for the reader to encounter English that may seem strange or strained or even foreign, because translation, as Heidegger insisted, is also about learning one's own language. He says we first have to learn our own language, and we do this through an encounter with the foreign, and translation is exactly such an encounter. And when I was thinking a little bit about this question in advance, I was reminded of some remarks Heidegger makes in the Ister course that I think are pertinent here. So in the Ister course, he remarks that the language of a historical people extends like a mountain range into the lowlands and flatlands, yet also has its occasional peaks that tower into an otherwise inaccessible altitude. And then Heidegger comments, and I quote here, the peak of a poetic or thoughtful work of language must not be worn down through translation, nor the entire mountain range leveled out into the flatlands of superficiality. The converse is the case. Translation must set us upon the path of ascent toward the peak. Making something understandable should never mean assimilating a poetic or thoughtful work to just any opinion or to the horizon of understanding of such opinion. End quote. So this is in German 76, pages 62 to 63 in the Ister translation. So the task, rather, Heidegger says, is to shatter the horizon and the obstinacy of habitual opinion. So I like this phrase that translation must set us upon the path of ascent towards the peak. That's a tall order. Translation doesn't provide direct access to the peak, nor should it pretend to do so. But at most, if it's successful, it sets us upon a path. It may be an invitation to experience something greater.
Part of our working process, so one of the things that I did, maybe kind of building off of what Will just offered about the Ister course, is, Heidegger's comments on the limitations of a literal translation. And so kind of as part of my apprenticeship with Will, who really is the better translator, I would do these very literal translations as kind of a first draft, focusing on what are the words that have already been translated, what are we kind of beholden to, given how particular words like Wesen or Walten had been translated, and then trying to stay true to Heidegger's word order so it wasn't a paraphrase. So there was a certain kind of literalness, but the literalness as trying to communicate the linguistic effect of how Heidegger was phrasing things, because the lecture courses are lecture courses. You know, they were written and they were spoken, which is something I became really fascinated by. What it is to write spoken language in my work in the archive. But one of the things that I really appreciated as Will and I would talk through what I had done as kind of a first draft, and we would retranslate it on Skype and type out what we had come up with, is Will's ability to stay true to how Heidegger's sentences are phrased, without falling into the kind of literalness that makes Heidegger read in this really weird way, in kind of the bad sense. So when there's the introduction of a conceptual term that is intended to be striking in terms of the structure of the sentence, the reader can feel the linguistic effect of an active conceptualization. And to maybe build off of what Will introduced about the mountain peak and you know, the flatlands, Heidegger in the Germanien and der Rhein course has, you know, he introduces this idea of the dialogue between the three creators, right? So poet, thinker, and then statesman. And one of the things that is what's going on with the thinker is the act of conceptualization of what the poet is doing. And so trying to figure out how to make those concept words, you know, that are very novel, especially for the interpretation of Hölderlin. Heidegger knows the audience he's speaking into in 1934, 35, and to try and be able to capture that through both the word and then the syntax of the sentence as being really important, internal to the lecture course itself, given what Heidegger has to say about attunement. So part of the challenge was trying to figure out how to be literal so the concepts could shine, how to be true to Heidegger, but not trying to make it, you know, hinky in the way that, you know, Heidegger translations can be, to have it kind of have a naturalness in English, but not something that was so natural that the strangeness of what Heidegger was actually doing as the dialogue with Hölderlin just kind of disappeared. So that was something that I was really attentive to as we went through my overly literal translations, and then, you know, Will's being able to just capture how a Heideggerian sentence is structured, and to try and keep the elements in place that is always just so elegant. I love that about you, Will. Like, that was one of the things I learned the most from. I've never been able to do it myself, but I know what it is to see it.
Well, this is kind of funny to hear, because I always thought that I was the more literal translator of the two of us. So maybe my memory is really fading here.
Thank you very much. So to my second question, which follows on, and it may sound like I'm trying to drum up some drama or controversy, but I wanted to ask if any disagreements arose while translating GA39. This leads on from the first question, and the notion that every translation is in itself an interpretation. And so it's probably more likely than not that you came to different conclusions about Heidegger's meaning in a certain place, and thus had to navigate how best to translate the word or sentence or paragraph. When I think of translations of Heidegger by solo translators, David Krause here, Richard Rochowitz is another one, Tom Sheehan, I think that's an incredibly difficult task, because as much as you could occasionally send your translations to colleagues or associates for comments, that constant discourse about the text in hand, being down in the trenches with your co-translator. Me and Lawrence are currently translating GA78, and we haven't strangled each other yet, but it could happen. So I wonder for both of you then, for Julia and Will, can you recall any moments where you simply disagreed on a translation and give us some insight into how you worked through that?
Oh, it was extremely dramatic. I mean, Julia was throwing dictionaries across the room at me all the time, saying, you cannot translate it this way.
Mm-hmm.
No, I mean, sorry to disappoint you, but it was completely undramatic, as I recall. I don't think we ever had profound disagreements about how to translate anything in particular. There was a lot of dialogue, a lot of back and forth about how best to render certain things. But we always ended up on the same page pretty straightforwardly, I think. That's my recollection, at least. Julia, maybe you have a different recollection.
No, I mean, I feel like we would, maybe with the poetry in particular, having to look up, and this was kind of, my task is, like we'd run into something with the poetry and I might have a question like, okay, this doesn't, like how does this one work? And then going back to the available translations, like, Hamburger and everything. And so I remember kind of that sense of feeling like, oh, I had more homework to do in trying to figure out really getting the poetry in a certain place. And one of the things that I think I am particularly proud of, and like I remember when we finished the last one that we finished was actually the remembrance course. And just the sense of like this project of all 3 lecture courses, it took Will and I over a decade. And so when we finished remembrance, it kind of felt like I finally was finished with graduate school. And I remember feeling kind of bereft in that moment. I'm like Will, like the translations of the poetry are really good. We should keep on going with the translations of the Hölderlin, because one of the things that I think that the Heidegger allowed us to do as part of that dialogue between, foreign and own poetry and thinking, is that we were able to, in certain instances with the poems in particular, recuperate a kind of spareness of the syntax or the paratactical structure that I think wound up being better translations of Hölderlin than the available translations. And so I remember some of our most detailed, kind of agonizing back and forths, not over the Heidegger, it was over the Hölderlin poems, and how could we do it in ways where the poetry stylistically, the spareness of the poetry, it fit with the Heidegger lecture course, and it didn't feel like we had just, quoted Hamburger or Siebert, like we referred to all of them and coming up with the translations. But the poetry really slowed us down, but in a good way. We had a very, just interrupted process with this, with just, teaching and life and things like that. And I think that there was something about the doing a translation together and then having interruption and then taking it back and taking it back up and being able to re-see it. I think it was, I don't know, it was really a labor of love. Through the years, it was slow with little disagreement, but I just remember the poetry, the discussions over the individual sentences of the poetry that we just wanted to get right.
Yeah, the poetry was definitely the most challenging material in those volumes. And actually, just a minor correction here, it took us over 20 years to do the 3 volumes. So the first one was published in '96, and the last one was published in 2018. So that's more than 2 decades. And we weren't working on them continuously, of course. It was an on and off process, just when we had time to go back to them. But yeah, it was a drawn out process. But for me, it was incredibly productive. I mean, it was productive not just in terms of translation itself or the actual translating of the lecture courses, but just philosophically incredibly productive. I think, I learned so much from Julia and Julia's understanding of Hölderlin and Hölderlin scholarship that far exceeds mine. So it was just a really productive process for me. And many of the translations I've done have been co-translations, and for that reason, really, that I get more out of the whole process than I do sitting and translating something on my own.
Thank you both very much. Well, I can open the floor to questions now. We could use the hand raising function. I know David has a question, so I'm going to let him, while you formulate your questions, I'll let David come in with his question.
Okay. I don't think I'll ask that technical question about line 70, but a more general question, okay? But I'd like to communicate with Will and Julie at some point about one of the line changes in one of the editions. But here's the general question. With Hölderlin, you have really 5 contemporary historical critical editions. Mm-hmm. And none of the 5 ever agree on everything. That is to say, in any given poem, except for the youthful poems, they have a difficult time understanding what Hölderlin reconceptualized, what he might have struck and replaced, or what he might have wanted to add to a line, and where exactly he would want to insert it. And so each editor has to guess, has to sort of, they just have to go by the seat of their pants and say, I think he wanted that line struck and this goes in instead, or no, he just wanted to add it somewhere. So I guess just the general question is, did that, of course, you're following Heidegger, who's following Hellingrath and Zinkernagel. Those 2 editions are declared, and you're dealing with Heidegger's text, not with Hölderlin's. But did you ever feel a kind of insecurity, maybe a profound insecurity about the textual basis of the Hölderlin poems? Because so often the sense of the poem is up for grabs with the change of this or that line. Were you spared that because you were able to stick with Heidegger's 2 editions, or did you ever get into a wrangle over what exactly, should we report on the 5 different editors' way of, interpreting this line of Germanien or this line of Der Rhein? Did you ever get into that kind of a struggle? Because if you're working simply on Hölderlin, it is a nightmare. You have to check all of these editions, and then you have to pack yourself off to Stuttgart, to the Landesmuseum, and try to look at the text yourself and make a decision. And that's, as a friend of mine from the South used to say, that's high cotton. That's really difficult stuff. But that's the question. Did Hölderlin's own text sometimes present for you guys a kind of nightmare, or were you spared all of that?
So I'll have Will answer, but my recollection is when we were translating, no, so Heidegger in every Hölderlin lecture course says that he's using both the Hellingrath and the Zinkernagel. What happened to me after the translation stuff, or again, I guess I didn't realize it quite took 20 years, but I had a further discovery in the archive with a correspondence between Heidegger and a Hölderlin scholar who was actually a lawyer named Lachmann. And this concerns the Semele strophe with As When on a Holiday. And one of the things that happened is there's been all of this literature, from Adorno to Zondi to de Man about the Semmelstrophe and the reading of the poet's vocation, and Heidegger's reviewing the manuscripts. And there has been this move to say, to kind of connect how Heidegger reads the Semmelstrophe of As When on a Holiday in particular to an authoritarian style of reading, right? So reading whether and how the poem fragments is something that is kind of the way Heidegger, as a reader of Hölderlin, comes to be adjudicated. And the thing that I discovered with this exchange between Heidegger and Lachmann is that Lachmann sent Heidegger copies of the manuscripts. He sent a philological reconstruction, the philological reconstruction that he was working on. This is referenced, so the kind of exchange between them is referenced at the end of Hölderlin and the Essence of Language. And the re-looking at the manuscripts, the looking at particular in this of the Semmelstrophe, it leads Heidegger to come up with his own version of that strophe when he gives the talk As When on a Holiday in 1939. And it's kind of this rogue, version. And it's really interesting. And I think that Heidegger is really, when he makes the change that he does in that edition, coming up with his own edition of the poem based upon the exchange with Lachmann and everything that Lachmann is doing, it really impacts Heidegger's reading and his understanding of the poet's reception, and the poet being between the reception of the divine and what goes on with the people. And I think it's a much better reading than de Man or Adorno. It is substantive. It's a substantively different reading, and Heidegger does things with it. And so that was the first moment for me when I found something in the archive where I realized, people didn't realize that Heidegger was having this detailed exchange with somebody who was trying to come up with how do you make the arguments between the Hellengrath and the Zinkernagel edition, because both of them didn't have kind of supporting apparatus for the decisions that they were making, and in particular with this poem that is establishing the poet's vocation and kind of that sense of Hölderlin as when does the late poetry begin. So that became had no idea about it other than Heidegger debates, the editions that he is using, but it became a scholarly problem for me at a later moment. I don't know. I mean, I have a very different relationship, and this again is something that came out of my work on the archive with Heidegger, to how to read manuscript pages, just the sense of what objective scholarship is, and what the act of reading is, and what the historicity of reading is. And so that was maybe the way in which I came to the problem that you're describing, David, after the fact, but not internal to our translation work. But I happen to love that problem because it forces so many issues about interpretation and translation.
Yeah.
And what is a text?
Yeah, it really is a problem that we were able to avoid extensively because, essentially because of the parameters of that were set by the Gesamtausgabe editors for these translations. We're not allowed to make editorial interventions or have extensive footnotes or anything like that, or scholarly apparatus. Even just explicating where Heidegger's getting his materials from. So any greater hermeneutic issues like that had to be set aside. We didn't have the same kind of license that you had, David, when you were translating the Nietzsche lecture courses, where you were able to, include extensive analysis, detailed footnotes, and all of that kind of thing. So all of that was essentially prohibited. So we were able to avoid that question. Fortunately, I think it would certainly have made it a much longer process to translate the 3 volumes in that case.
Yeah. Can I add a PS there?
Of course, please do.
it seems to me that the little bit of work that I was able to do with Heidegger showed me a Heidegger who was actually very, very concerned that appropriate apparatus be added when needed. For example, he quotes De Anima from the Teubner edition, and the Oxford Classical text alters the reading of the Greek. And so he said to me, you have to enter a footnote into the translation to explain that I was using the Teubner edition and not the Oxford Classical text, and say that I would have used the OCT if I'd had it. If it had been available, I would have used it. But in 1927, it wasn't there. And so I'm citing the Teubner edition. And so this runs against the grain of this kind of, it's become a very popular idea that Heidegger himself paid no attention to philological matters. And that's just false. And I think that was a claim made by certain editors, and it was a claim that Clusterman wanted to hear because you can sell books faster if you don't have to take decades figuring out what the text should be. But it's a bit of a scandal because I think you two understand this as much as I do. Heidegger really was concerned to get the best philological basis that he could find, you know. And so it's a shame what has happened with all of the translations. It's a terrible shame, and we hope that future generations will have access to Marbach, a more generous access, so that everything can be checked. Heidegger himself would have wanted that. And it's the folks who came after his death who claim that he had no use for philology. That needs to be said every now and then, I think.
Thank you very much. Casey, I think you were first with your hand up. Casey Spinks?
Yeah, I have my question in the chat in case the background noise gets too loud, so just let me know if it does. I think this question is interesting and relevant to any translation work about what approach you take, but I think it's especially relevant to Heidegger translation especially. When setting out to translate this piece, did you try to act consciously as if nobody had ever translated Heidegger before? Or were you very conscious of standing within a tradition and therefore a conversation of English translation of Heidegger? Just curious about your method as somebody who's interested in translating myself. I err towards the side of trying to act as if nobody had translated this before. But especially with Heidegger, there's such a strong and controversial translation that you can't help but be in conversation, it seems.
Yeah,
Will, do you want to start with that one? Because, I mean, you translated so much Heidegger before we had, you know, even started with the Ister. So, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it's an excellent question. I think we were certainly very mindful all the time of existing translations and the sort of decisions that those translations had made. And I think we don't want to. On the one hand, we never wanted to be beholden to those translations in the sense of just repeating a translation that someone else had decided on. But on the other hand, we didn't want to just introduce novel translations for the sake of being novel. So you have to steer a kind of fine line between those two positions, as it were. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to say about that particular issue. I think you know, our translation decisions were always dependent more on the particular text itself that we're translating rather than what other people had done in other translations of Heidegger, for instance. So the text itself that we were dealing with had to come first, and it was always a question of what makes the best sense, what best conveys Heidegger's meaning in this particular lecture course. And of course, when one thinks about it, even Heidegger's use of German terms is not identical from one period of his work to another or one text to another. So we can't just impose a kind of correct translation for each Heideggerian term or something like that that should be maintained across all translations of Heidegger texts from different periods.
I think one thing that I can say is that we started kind of from our own dialogue, and then we would check back, so how was it translated in elucidations, or, how did we translate it in the Ister? And so sometimes we kind of were critical of things that we had done in the Ister, but there was a French translation of GA39. And so one of the things that we often did to kind of just say, like, okay, let's check with the, like the semantic feel of, the translation, is we would often kind of, check with the French, just because it was not because we were going to adopt it, but because it just got us thinking about what we could do in the translation. But I think it was very much kind of this, starting from the resources that we had, and then checking, and then seeing what might be, what was already out there that we thought might work or be stronger, or so there was the sense that we were locating things in a tradition. But the big thing is, Heidegger's language becomes so influenced by Hölderlin, and so the GA39 in particular marks a shift in Heidegger's language. And so I think we kind of felt that we had the chance to kind of rethink certain terms that might have already been translated, because there's a certain way in which the first Hölderlin lecture course is a source text for later terms.
Alberto?
Thank you, Julia. Well, my question is very specific. The issue came up the other day in the group discussion about whether the word folk should be translated as people, as you chose to do, or as nation, to the extent that in the lecture course, folk always refers to the people as a national people, as the German nation. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, and why you chose to translate as people rather than as nation.
I'm trying to remember if we talked about this one extensively. So if you go back to, just Hölderlin's poem, voice of the, like voice of the folk, right? Voice of the nation, voice of the people. This, like this is where I am at, so like maybe, I mean, I think that this is an interesting conversation for Will and I to have in retrospect, but for me, part of what's going on with the Germanien and der Rhein course as a kind of political intervention is it's a contestation of some basic terms, right? Including, folk as being an important one, and then also Schicksal, destiny. And so for me, I think that there's something about what Heidegger is doing in relationship between the dialogue between the poet's reception of the divine as itself constituting a folk, and then his own philosophical kind of, intervention into that structure, where I think whatever the folk is constituted as a certain kind of event of language that comes out of Hölderlin's poetry. And so I think it is a volatile, contested term, but I like people better, because Heidegger is really clear that the German whatever folk is not yet, and could only come out of a reception of Hölderlin's poetry. And so I think it has a undecidable ambivalence, and I don't mean undecidable in the Derridian kind of sense, but I think it's an active kind of positioning as with respect to how we actually locate the political. And so I would want to keep the ambivalence as citing on Hölderlin, but as being located in a political context that Heidegger is very well aware of.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I was also very much in favor of translating it as people rather than something like nation. It is used in the plural as well in the text. It's not just the German people, it's the peoples. There are many peoples for Heidegger. And I mean, I think given that he wants to recuperate a different sense of the political or move towards a different sense of the political, it's too reductive to me to translate it simply as nation, in the sense of a nation state or something like that. So I think people keeps it more ambiguous. It keeps it more open. It leaves it more up to interpretation, and to it exposes us more to the ambiguities of what Heidegger's trying to do in his readings of Hölderlin.
Frank, I think you were next, then Lawrence, then Richard.
My question is for Julia. So I'm worried maybe I should wait because it has to do with her legibility essay. So should I wait until, because I don't want to defer or derail.
Well, yeah, we can suspend that till after. Yeah. Okay, Lawrence then. Lawrence, you're muted, I think. Richard then.
Thanks. Well, it's good to see you, Julia and Will and everybody else. I usually can't make it this semester, but had to show up for this one. Your answer to the folk question was so interesting that I thought I'd just bring up another word that comes up in this lecture series, Unwesen, which is a concept and word that's fascinated me for a while. And I think you have one of the more successful translations of this as corrupted essence. But of course, one of the constraints on these translations is that you can't get into long explanations of why you chose these renditions, and you don't. But I wonder if you remember thinking about that, or whether you have any ideas about the meaning of that word Unwesen.
I mean, my only recollection about it is that we came up with that particular translation at a very late stage, because initially I think we were just translating it as non-essence or something like that. And then the more we read through the translation, the more we thought that non-essence is just not what Heidegger means here. It just doesn't work in terms of the meaning of the text. So that led us to consider other possibilities, and at some very late point we hit upon corrupted essence, which seemed to make more sense in terms of the text itself. I don't know if you recall anything more about that decision, Julia.
Yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, Richard, but it's the context of when we use the corrupted essence. It's the moment where Heidegger's talking about the dangerousness of language. And I think that one of the things that I remember Will and I talking about is that there's this essence, non-essence, and it kind of makes things be binary versus there's a way in which the Unwesen participates in the essence of language, and it's part of the structure, the inevitable structure of the dangerousness of language. That part of the thing you have to do is you have to hear through the corrupted essence of language in order to get to the disclosive event of language. And I think that I remember us talking about, the corrupted essence of the idea of the Unwesen as a corrupted essence. It has this way of participating in the notion of essence that is not just an ambiguity between essence and non-essence. There's a double ambiguity, right? There's a double ambiguity that locates how Heidegger, like this is the first time that he's really thinking about the disclosive event of danger, like the danger that saves, and so I think it was something that we talked a lot about because it's something that comes back for Heidegger at a conceptual level, both with regard to danger and then to the thought of essence and non-essence. And so that's the conversation I remember us having and really talking a lot about, oh, well, what goes on with the event of language where it has to endanger itself through its own corrupted essence in order for it to preserve an event structure, right? As the dimension of the essence of the disclosivity of the poetic event of language. And so we had a very extensive conversation about that because it felt so loaded, given, just given what Heidegger had already written about Wesen and Unwesen. Nice to see you, Richard, but does that do anything for you?
We're running out of time. Lawrence, a very quick question.
Yeah, sorry, my apologies. I've had a few technical problems on this end. I mean, it's very quickly actually to say thank you for the translation, because without it, we couldn't have had this year's reading group. And it's been, I mean, I think the things that you've clarified today have been enormously helpful. Sometimes one finds oneself, as it were, taking issue with the translation, but I've stressed all the way through that our issues, I think, are that when you come to this, as it were, as a scholarly group, it's very different to presenting something to a general reader. This is something that Aaron and I have had in mind in translating GA 78, that as it were, you're not there with a supporting group of people, Greek in one hand or Hölderlin, Zinkernagel or FA edition in the other, but rather having to direct something that you hope will at least open the text up, but can't hold someone's hand while they do it. So I mean, I want to just say thank you for 20 years of amazing work, without which the work that we've done wouldn't be possible. And I think, and to draw attention to those issues that you've drawn attention to, of what translation both can and cannot do, because it's easy to take issue with the translation. Everybody does it all the time. That is the process of thinking itself. It's not actually, it's one thing to take issue with the translation. It's quite another to take issue with the translators, to whom one owes a great debt. And so that it's to thank you and to in small part repay that debt that we hope that we're paying in larger part by using your translation in the work we've been doing this year.
Thank you, Lawrence. That's very kind of you. As you know yourselves, I mean, it's really a thankless undertaking, all this translation work, and one certainly doesn't do it for the financial compensation or anything like that. I have a funny story to add in this respect with regard to this particular volume. If you look at the Library of Congress publishing data at the beginning of the book, it lists as the translators, the first translator, McNeill, William Hardy. That's not me. That's a guy who was a historian at the University of Chicago. So not only do I do all of this work for, Julie and I do all of this work for zero compensation, but I don't even get the credit for the work from the Library of Congress.
Can I just say on that, I mean, in terms of funny stories around translation, so when we did the translation for Northwestern of Der Arbeiter, Bogdan Koster and I, they tried to screw us down to a zero royalties contract. And I said that I was happy for them not to pay for me, but I was never going to sign a piece of paper that actually was saying that I was going to work for free. And they said, why not? And I said, well, I thought your country had abolished slavery. If I may say so, they didn't laugh. And so we agreed a contract where if we sold some enormous number of copies of Der Arbeiter, then we would finally get royalties. I have never ever seen a statement of sales of Der Arbeiter since signing that contract. I mean, it's now been in print for just under 8 years, and I've never seen a word from them. So yes, no one does this for the remuneration. But thank you, Will. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you so much. I mean, I just, I don't know. I still think it's one of the most important things that I've done in my scholarly life. I don't know. It has this independent existence, and you guys are reading it, and I love. Well, Andenken is my favorite volume, but I have a very fraught relationship with this volume.
Thank you very much. Well, I can now hand over to Julie, who's going to take us through some of her experiences spending time in the archive, working with J39. So, Julie, I'm just going to hand over to you.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that we get to your question, Frank, but I wrote my dissertation on this volume, and so when I had the chance to go back to Germany, I thought, okay, I'll go to Marbach and I'll look at the manuscripts. And as I wrote in my piece, it was a very convoluted process to try and get the copy of the manuscript. So the thing I was able to get access to was what's called Heidegger B, and so it's all of the stuff that has been donated to the archive by other people. And so this wound up being really interesting, because the thing that I was able to do is I was able to get this Hallwachs. It's not he doesn't refer to the manuscript, but he's the person who he developed a personal shorthand where he was able to take these very detailed notes of Heidegger lecture courses and then kind of compare them to what we have as the published Gesamtausgabe text. And one of the things that Will had charged me with, when you go to the archive and look at the manuscripts, see if there are the kind of Wiederholungen, that we saw in the Ister course, and the evidence for them is in the Hallwachs, copies, student lecture notes, and there were things that Heidegger delivered verbally. So I went through all of the student transcripts for, any Hölderlin lecture course. But in the context of going through the Germanien and der Rhein course, I looked at something by Louisa Krohn. Of course, I knew that there was a problem with GA38, but I didn't really kind of connect that it was the person that, the same person where it was based off of her notes. And so there was the beginning of the way in which the Germanien and der Rhein course read, it was like very schematic. Like it was so out of sync with what the first part of the Germania part of the lecture course was doing. I wasn't even quite sure what its relationship to the edited volume was. And then all of a sudden I hit the Rhine part, and it's a manuscript copy. And I can tell that because it has page numbers that correspond to the manuscript, and because she is transcribing being with a Y correctly every single time. And then I hit this page that one of the things that Will and I had also done is you could just tell that there are probably, something got messed up by the editor, or there was some sort of ambiguity. And so I think that we had a couple of instances marked, but this is, what happened when I hit German 195, 196, where I'm reading this and all of a sudden I see this reference to the inner truth of National Socialism. And I'm like, what? And it's the day I'm leaving. And so I copy out what I had read, and then I kind of think, oh, she probably made a mistake because, again, it doesn't match the edited volume. And then it just kind of sticks with me, because what the edited volume has is the inner truth of natural science, which is not a possible formulation for Heidegger. And so I went back to the archive. I was able to get the page. I was able to actually understand that what I was seeing was an abbreviation. And then the thing that became really important that was this sense of, oh, there's something here that is a lost idiom, a lost political idiom that is locating the reference to the inner truth of National Socialism. And it's this phrase that just seems very generic, called the new concept of science. So if you look at this, at the Der Spiegel interview, Heidegger will refer to this as political science. And the new concept of science was doing Wissenschaft according to race. And so if you were to return to the rectoral address, in the fourth paragraph of the rectoral address, there's this reference to the new concept of science. And it's a National Socialist idiom. If you go to Facts and Thoughts, he will refer to the new concept of science. And so the new concept of science was Wissenschaft according to racial biologism. And so this is something that comes up a lot for Heidegger in a lot of, courses during this period of time, where all of a sudden he'll be referring to the new concept of science, and then there'll be some sort of a political intervention. And so the thing that I had to figure out is kind of reading a whole series of parentheticals on the manuscript page, where the reference to the inner truth of National Socialism was being located by the new concept of science. And so I later, found out, and this was talking to David Krell, it was talking to von Bülow, head of Marbach, who was Larissa Krohn. And, she has this kind of manuscript history with Heidegger, and she was the wife of a Freiburg bookseller. There's a correspondence there that I couldn't get access to. But the thing that really happened for me is, thinking about, if you really want what the lecture course was in real time, the most true version of that is Halvax's basically verbatim student lecture notes. Louisa Krohn, or I'm sorry, Susanna Ziegler, the editor of GA39, goes back and she tries to add in what is in the manuscript beyond what goes on with the Fritz Heidegger typescript, but she garbles it because the parentheticals, they do not integrate into the flow of the manuscript itself. And so this is what an editor faces, right? Where you have this aside that was not delivered as part of the lecture course itself. It's kind of more in the ambit of the Black notebooks. And it's not meant probably to be part of the lecture course. And when she goes to put it in, she can't really decipher the multiple abbreviations. And then it's an aside, right? It's not part of the flow. And this led to this kind of crisis, for me, is, well, what do we think a Heidegger text is, right? Because it's not what was spoken in the lecture course. When you take the Ister, the entire third part of the lecture course was not delivered, so we have it in manuscript form. And so this is this, to go back to the question that David asked about,
Hang on.
what is the text, and so that messed with me, and then there was this huge, attempt to, Will and I could not
Got it.
correct the manuscript or correct the translation when we got it published. So I was able to get permission from Heidegger's son to get my article published, and then they since, did the corrigenda on the Klosterman page. But I don't know. It's really complicated, but it's complicated for me in the most interesting way.
Thank you very much, Julia. Frank, did you want to come in with your question to conclude the session? Sorry, Frank, you're muted. maybe we should leave it there then. And Frank, maybe you could pop an email over to Julia. Well, that brings us to 5 o'clock UK time, at least. So perhaps we could say thank you once again to Julia and to Will for coming along and sharing their experiences of translating this text. It was a really fascinating discussion, so thank you both so much. And
thank you, Aaron. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah,
very
thank you
much.
so much. Yeah.
Come back to us soon, Julia, and we recommence with the text again next week. So see you all next week. Bye.
David Krell, I'll look forward to being in touch with you.
Thank you. Likewise.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.